Let's move on to the other big domestic story of the day, and the federal government will attempt later today to resurrect its Malaysia People Swap deal in federal parliament. The Prime Minister is aiming to get amendments to the Migration Act through the House of Representatives so it can process asylum seekers in Malaysia.
But many refugee advocates are concerned the deal does not meet UN conventions for the treatment of refugees. Julian Burnside QC is a human rights lawyer and he joins us now in the studio. Julian Burnside, good morning.
Good morning.
Now, the West Australian newspaper is reporting this morning that Tony Crook will vote against this deal. You would see that as a good outcome?
Yeah, the problem I have with all of this is that both of the major parties are talking about so-called offshore processing. But in fact what they're talking about is pushing asylum seekers away, never to return. They're not being sent away to be processed and, if successful, being returned to Australia to be resettled. They're being pushed away from Australia, full stop. You know, the processing, such as it is, will simply mean that those people hang around in Malaysia or wherever they're sent to for years or decades until some country puts up its hand and says, we will offer you protection. We're sending them, or planning to send them, to a place that will not offer them protection.
If this bill does go down, where does this leave the government? What would you like the government to do, considering there have been, 700 people coming since the High Court ruling, and places like Christmas Island are already struggling to cope?
Yeah, look, I think the reason that there is a problem is that we detain people indefinitely if they come here by boat. If they come by plane and they ask for asylum, they're allowed to live in the community while their claim for asylum is processed, even though most of them don't succeed. If they come by boat, they are detained, most of them, indefinitely until the end of their process, and that may take years. So of course the detention centres fill up, understandably. The irony is that most asylum seekers who come to Australia by boat succeed in establishing their entitlement to protection. The weird thing is we don't lock up the ones who are least likely to be real refugees. We do lock up the ones who are most likely to be real refugees, and in doing so we cause them terrible harm before we say, oh yes, you're entitled to live here. Now that's crazy. It costs a fortune and it does immense damage to people.
But if you abolish mandatory detention, the government then obviously has to pay for accommodation in the community for these refugees. That is also another consideration, the cost.
Well, that's a consideration, but it's far less expensive to have people housed in the community than to have them locked up in high security in a remote place like Christmas Island. At the moment, we're spending about $1 billion a year locking up a relative handful of people who've come here asking for protection. If they were detained, I mean, of course people should be detained initially if they arrive in the country without papers. I don't have a problem with that. Detain them initially for initial health and security checks. But then I would say after the first month, release them into the community on conditions that keep them available for the rest of their processing, allow them to live in the community, allow them to work, become productive, and then at the end of their processing, if they succeed, of course they stay in the community with a protection visa. If they fail, remove them. Now, that would cost probably 1/10 of what we spend now.
What do you make of the government's argument that if, for argument's sake, this vote does go down in care of Tony Crook today, that impinges on the principle of executive authority? The government argues it has the right, or should have the right, to set border protection policies.
Well, look, I understand that. It's actually not about border protection, by the way. These people do not represent a threat or a risk to the country. And it's not about border control, actually, either, because, you know, around about 3 or 4 million people come into this country every year for tourism, business, this and that. If we have leakage of a few thousand each year in an arrival rate of 4 million, that's pretty good border control, actually, by any standard. So what it is, I think, is just about the two major parties trying to show how tough they can be. Now, I think most of the community would like to see boat people treated a bit more decently than they are, and I'm sure all of us would like to see $1 billion spent a bit more sensibly than by throwing it at brutalising people and causing them harm.
Of course, the common refrain from the government is that they want to smash the people smuggling business model.
Yeah.
If you do abolish mandatory detention, if there is no offshore processing, how do you address what they describe as that pull factor, making Australia that attractive place for people to get on, as they call it, a leaky boat and come here to try to seek asylum?
First of all, I don't agree with the idea that, you know, by not mistreating them, we will make more people come. You know, the boat people are coming here because they're running away from the Taliban, not because they want to live in a different country. They just don't want to be killed by their own countrymen. The second thing is, I'm not sure that it's a good idea that you mistreat innocent people. They haven't broken the law by coming here. Mistreat innocent people in order to deter others from asking for our help. And the third thing is about breaking the people smugglers' business model. You may hate people smugglers, they may be awful people, but they are the last line of escape for people who are in hopeless, desperate positions. And cutting off a person's last line of escape is not a kind thing to do. I just think both major parties are having this sort of crazy political fight between themselves, whereas either of them could stand up and say, we are capable as a country of treating these people decently. We're not going to waste taxpayers' money by mistreating them. And, you know, if the numbers got out of control, of course we can rethink it. But history and geography suggest that will never happen.
Just finally, there are two prongs to this deal, 800 to Malaysia in return for 4,000 genuine refugees. What would you call on the government to do regarding those 4,000 if the vote goes against them today?
Well, I think they should probably honour their promise. You know, by any standards, Australia receives a very small number of refugees each year. If we have an additional 4,000 over the next 4 years, because that's the way it was structured, then that's not going to be any great problem.
We'll find out very shortly, I think, when we hear from Tony Cook. Julian Burnside, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.